For a long time, I have been extremely curious about everything there is to know for this character. She was the original one showcased at the end of the Game Awards trailer when this game was officially entering its next chapter, and now I'm here to bring her full story right to you. Isabella's story is so far without a doubt the most detailed origin story we have for any character. I have to warn you that there will be some massive spoilers during this video, and this had to be collected over several different testing phases and methods because of how long it really was. There's multiple chapters and different perspectives that this story is told through, and I even went so far as to commission a 2D animator to help showcase some of this, but let's go ahead and start with the main character herself and what she was like before she even stepped anywhere near Aeternum. So the stories don't exactly say where she's from, but she does seem to be from the time period around 16th to 17th century. The very first thing her story starts with is a letter titled In the Morning. This is told from the perspective of a narrator named Federico. He states that he has informed Lady Isabella about the news about her parents' death. It's told that Isabella had multiple brothers, but unfortunately they were lost at sea the year before this, and news about her parents dealt a terrible blow to her spirit. Not only that, but it seems like her father gained a considerable amount of debt alongside her brothers. And they did this by going on joint ventures under a company known as the Red Sign, whom the narrator is unfamiliar with. He says that these ventures took place at different islands around the New World, but he also says that Isabella's family had fortunes that were lost because of this. This seems to suggest that Isabella and her family were at least some form of nobility, even if they were potentially on the lower side. So the narrator decides that he's going to contact a priest that might be able to comfort Isabella, but first we do have a page that comes from her perspective on the situation. So the page is called Comfort and comes from the captain's log journal from Isabella's point of view. It starts with her saying she often seeks comfort at the small chapel on the grounds. She says that it's peaceful there, quiet, and she can hear herself think. She knows that the servants, at least those that remain, think that she comes there to pray, which she does, but she mainly comes to listen to her thoughts, to sort through them so that she might hopefully make sense of it all. This seems to take place about a month after her mother and father's funeral. Between her talking about her servants in this chapel that's on the quote-unquote grounds, and how she refers to her family's wealth as the family fortune, it does seem to pretty much confirm that she was a noble. And in this entry, she said that she would trade places with her father and brothers, not necessarily in death, but being upon the seas, to be far from this place. Now with all this loss, she still remains strong, but she feels older than her years should allow, and feels regret that there aren't enough years in one's life to do all that she wishes to do. Yet in this simple church, she feels at peace, and she takes comfort in that. So at this point in the entries, it seems that Isabella is really just someone trying to get through life to the best of their ability. She doesn't seem to have the biggest ambitions and basically just wants to be free and not be locked down by the years that pass and start to peel away at her body. And at this point in the story, she seems almost like she would take any way out of this hell that her family has left her in. So the next page is from her perspective too. It's titled Rumors. So the priest that was contacted previously comes to visit her in the church. He sits with her and they discuss her feelings and thoughts about what's happened. The priest quotes some scripture to her as a form of comfort, and she confides in him and says that she feels the absence of her family, the fear of being in debt that she's now inherited, and aside from the looming misfortune, there was also the looming presence of age to contend with. She says to him that her father spoke often of a fountain of youth, somewhere he might be able to take back his years and gain enough of them to recover from the trials that life had brought with it. The priest, he was silent at this, then said, almost apologetically, that we were given this life with the requisite number of years, because if we had more, it might cheapen the beauty of life. And to wish to extend one's life, and he looked quite pained at this, was even considered offensive, he said, heretical by the church. And he spoke as if he heard some heretics saying such, which ended up piquing Isabella's curiosity. She decided to press him on it during the conversation, and he protested that she misread his tone. Anyone speaking, let alone claiming to have proof of such nonsense, would be kept under lock and key so they wouldn't be able to spread their madness. Isabella thinks that he knows somebody like this. She is sure of it, and she decides it's time to make inquiries. We then fast forward to a page known as Visiting the Church. The narrator says that we, including Isabella, traveled there by coach over several days. He was not privy to the visit, but Isabella met with the man in his cell alone, and spoke with him for hours before she finally returned. Her eyes were bright, and despite the previous days that had worn upon her, she seemed invigorated with new life. The narrator says that he's seen this before, and did not like it. He sees the light in her eyes that burned in her brother's eyes and her father's eyes, suggesting that he must be a long-standing friend of the family, perhaps a butler or assistant to Isabella. Basically seems like an Alfred situation. So in a worried way, he asked her how the conversation went, and she said, the treasure upon the man was not the Azoth, but the man himself. She said that he was living proof that the Fountain of Youth existed, and it could grant eternal life to those who found it. So it seems that whatever happened between her and this mystery man, who was shortly after identified as the heretic, proved beyond doubt that this island of eternal youth does exist. And the narrator asked, what could be gained from such knowledge? And she laughed lightly and replied, because he can take us there. So who is this mystery guy she spoke with from what we know so far? There's a page a little further on called A Heretic's Title. The narrator says that he was told by one of the men on this expedition that he used to be a priest. He claimed that we worship the wrong power, and the divine rests within the earth, and that God is false. So as soon as I read this, I know that it kind of changes things about the world of Aeternum and what we might see in the future. If this heretic who is rumored to be immortal is to be believed, then our old pal Captain Thorpe, who identifies himself as the master of the Tempest, cannot in any way be this big dog, unless they plan on changing the story. But whatever this entity is, it seems like he or she is the true god of corruption. So that much seems to be getting confirmed here so far. So the next part picks up with Isabella having a conversation with the Crown. Isabella claimed that the island the prisoner spoke of was under the name Vitae Aeternum. The narrator says that this conversation she had lit a fire in her and gave her a frightening sense of purpose. I mean, at this point in time, I think we can understand what she's going through. She lost her mother, her brothers, and her father. And a big part of it was because of these expeditions they were trying to take in search of this Fountain of Youth. And now she has confirmation that it really exists. It seems like she's not just doing this for herself, but to find success where her family failed before. So as the narrator says, he urged her to rest, cautiously, but she would not hear it. The mere hint of the Fountain of Youth had caused her to move into action. Now the Crown was not so understanding. You see, they had been willing to back her request to see the prisoner, but a Fountain of Youth returned a different answer for them. And the adding factor of her father's debt caused an unexpected result, which I'm guessing means that basically, the Crown said no. The narrator then says that had Isabella chose to mention Azoth more in her conversation with the Crown, he suspects that the expedition may have turned out quite differently, and Isabella may not have been the captain at all. But it turns out that the royal family during this time wasn't the only ones interested in the substance of Azoth. The properties of it had already sparked a lot of rumors throughout the nations, and even companies were formed with the goal of finding out how the substance could be replicated or found. So the Red Sign Company, as we had talked about earlier, they were one of the companies formed in the pursuit of gaining Azoth. In the contract that Isabella signed related to this expedition that the narrator later examines, it seems to be directly tied to that very same company. In the next page, titled The Heretic, the narrator questions how the company started to organize so quickly. By this point, it seems like they're currently preparing for an expedition to this island. He theorizes that the discovery of the New World was surely the main inspiration, suggesting that at this point in time they are somewhere in or just after the Age of Discovery. And he also says that for those that have landed on this new continent, no source of this Azoth has yet been found. The only proof was coming from the madman and his preaching. So already the narrator is very suspicious and probably not too happy that this heretic has infested Isabella's mind with this idea. In the next portion, he says that he was able to examine the contract that Isabella had signed. He states that he noticed the seal being rather unusual. He says that it was embedded in red wax, as expected, but he felt that the symbol almost expressed the color of crimson in its strange geometry. Isabella, noticing his gaze, tells him that she has seen that symbol, and it was drawn with who knows what all over the heretic's cell, also in red. Azoth is not the true wealth of the island, she says. Vitae Aeternum's value lies much deeper than a vial of blue fire, despite the fact that it rises from the ground in such quantities that it is similar to a field of produce ready to be harvested. So at this point, and from the previous description the heretic gave of the divine, it seems that something is absolutely underneath the island of Aeternum. We know, of course, that they have been referencing to the corruption in some way, but the way the heretic describes this divine really makes me think that the island is a containment cell of a dark god. After this, we come to a page called The Expedition. The narrator wonders how she managed it. Isabella is to be in command of the expedition. He has no idea how she negotiated such a result, or where she received the gold to back 3 different ships of the expedition, but he suspects that she concluded the contract with the Red Sign, and the company now moves with the faith in the presence of Azoth that matches Isabella's faith in it. We have 3 ships for this expedition: the Santiago, the Santa Maria de la Consolacion, and the San Cristobal. So the narrator starts to wonder. The ships are preparing to set sail in a matter of months, yet there's still a question of where they are all bound. Do they intend to scour all of the Atlantic, and what has she offered them, when she has no gold to her name, nor land to speak of, or any influence whatsoever? And this page is followed by one called The Expedition Embarks. On the very day that the expedition set sail, the narrator finally found out what Isabella had been using in her negotiations. It was shackled beneath the decks of the Constellation, the ship that Isabella would be spearheading. It was a dirty, hunched man with a great beard and eyes like embers in the hollow of his face. His wrists and ankles were clapped in irons even though there was nowhere for him to run. So at this point he knows that she freed this man from the prison cell of the church. And not only that, but the Company of the Red Sign sought to extract the knowledge of the Isle of Azoth from this madman many times. But he said that the only one he would show would be Isabella. She must be captain. Do this, the heretic said, and I will show you the way to Vitae Aeternum. It is the devil's price, and Isabella has paid it. So this man, the narrator thinks, barely human, is to be the guide of the expedition. If he had known, he would never have come aboard, and now he fears where the words of this man will take them. So when they're out at sea, things already start to go from bad to worse. Isabella spends most of her days below deck speaking with the heretic, and the narrator seems extremely concerned with this. But each conversation that she has with him seems to calm her, and we adjust our course after each and every discussion. We then come to a page that's titled, "The Sea is Against Us." This is when the expedition starts to suffer. The narrator says that at first, the lack of wind proved to be difficult, and now a storm strikes at them again and again. They seem to be circling entire sections of the ocean, always at Isabella's insistence, but it's almost as if the heretic's navigation is meant to cost them time, their food stores, and their faith. Their supplies are beginning to run low, and their tempers among the crew have started to rise. He suspects that the crew would blame Isabella if not for her bouts of sickness, not from the voyage but from the fever that seems to strike whenever the winds are calm. But when the storm besets them, she's on deck, with authority and command that puts the crew to task. Really makes me wonder what kind of deal or devil's price she had to pay in the heretic's offer. The next section begins with the page called "The Skill of a Chief Pilot." It says that the Santiago and the San Cristobal seem to fare a little better than they do. One time a storm almost separated the Constellation from the Santiago, but Chief Pilot Chiez on the San Cristobal found her and brought her back to them. The narrator fears that only the navigation of Pilot Chiez has saved them not once but twice now. They say that they didn't have the opportunity to meet Chiez, but they pray that they do not lose her before they discover that they need to turn back, because she is exceptionally gifted. And then we have a page called "A Coming Mutiny." You see, the crew of the Constellation has grown to fear Isabella and her authority. But even so, the disposition of the crew has started to get really ugly. Fights have broken out, and the other day, the narrator says, one man nearly stabbed another for a perceived insult. All the while a storm is still bearing down incredibly hard on them. The crew's whispers have started to grow to rumors and angry words. They speak of the heretic as a curse. They say that he exerts a devilish influence upon the voyage and the captain. The narrator fears that if they do not find some hint of Aeternum soon, there will be a mutiny, and Isabella may not see it coming until it's too late. Well, unfortunately, they get themselves a little big slice of Aeternum, starting with the next page known as "The Storm." They lost sight of the Santiago at first. He fears that it now lies at the bottom of the ocean, and whatever has become of it and the San Cristobal, only God knows their fate. They are fighting for their lives, and they may not even last the night. Yet even through the storms, the narrator hears laughing below deck. But what he was laughing at, he does not know. He has led Isabella straight to this hell, and they were foolish enough to join them. And then we come to the landing, specifically a crash landing to be exact. We finally arrived on the island of Aeternum. The perspective continues with our narrator, who we can now finally identify as being named Federico. All of the letters we've gone through so far from his perspective are signed with the letter F, but the actual journal chapter is named Federico's Letters. So Federico says that most of the crew is missing when they awake, but Captain Isabella is undeterred. She starts scouring the shores looking for supplies and organizing the men. Their ship lies upon the rocks and seems without repair, and both the Santiago and the San Cristobal are nowhere to be found. Which the narrator gives the question to Isabella if they should search for them, but nope, she says that they must explore the island and learn more about their surroundings. There was nothing more that could be done to help the other ship's crews, only themselves. And of course, the heretic survived. The narrator noticed that he was still shackled, yet he was smiling. Sand was on his brow, his face, and his lips, as if he had touched it to the shore, kissing it as a welcome. We then move on to the next few pages. They've set up camp and gathered what supplies they could from the shipwreck. Isabella's health has seemingly improved ever since she arrived on the island, but it seems like she's starting to change. Her determination is becoming more apparent, and she's starting to get more suspicious and controlling of the crew. Even as the men try to gather and forage around, she's reluctant to let them out of her sight and demands that they report back with any findings. And then we come to a page known as Federico's Punishment. Unfortunately, the perspective here changes from our dear narrator to a new one under the name of Ruiz Villaquez. So apparently, Isabella has found the letters of Frederico. She immediately scatters them, shredding each page from its spine and casting it into the wind. That poor man, now bound, reminiscing about how he did think about refraining from further documentation of their journey, begs her. He begs for forgiveness, but nope, Isabella is shouting over him, claiming that he tried to purposely conceal these from her and that they were full of lies, containing thoughts of mutiny and doubts in the voyage. Basically, she's super pissed and the rest of the crew are scared out of their minds right now. At this point, we have a little bit of a divide between the crew. We have the loyalists that are blindly following Isabella out of devotion, and the other side who are incredibly fearful or angry, and at this point looking for any chance they can get. Now the heretic during all of this is being completely quiet. Our new narrator notices this and says that he's just been weaving a rope of hemp on the island, but for what purpose he does not know. So at this point, Isabella is starting to get even more ruthless and suspicious. She refuses to send out scouts for the crews of the other ships, and our narrator predicts that the Santiago was surely sunk beneath the waves, but the San Cristobal, the ship that was being crewed by our famous pilot Chiez, he has more faith in. If anyone could survive those storms, it would have been her. So at the camp, they've started to do nightly patrols, and our narrator wanted to make sure that the heretic was securely bound at all times. He tells one of the other crewmates known as Alvaro to make sure of this, but something interesting happens on one of those nights. The narrator discovers Alvaro and some of the men have been making a joke of the rope that the heretic has been weaving. He's fashioned it into a cord and looped it around the heretic's neck, and was dragging him about as if he was on a leash, hence the title of the journal page. Well, even the heretic, he's laughing alongside the men. He's enjoying it. And then Ruiz comes up and puts a stop to it. But as they're starting to remove the cord from the heretic's neck, he suddenly speaks to Alvaro, and he says, "It's your turn to wear it now." And then of course in response, Alvaro laughs at this. He shoves the heretic back, but the heretic keeps persisting at this. And then suddenly Alvaro strikes him, and he says he'll do no such thing. And then in a very odd way, the heretic then replies to this and says, "It won't be your choice." So this makes Alvaro pissed off. He decides to kick what remains of the heretic's water and food bowl straight into the muck, and at which point our narrator reprimanded him and thought about simply burning the rope that the heretic made, but there was something strange about this rope. He says that he could not bring himself to do so. Actually, even just the thought of touching it suddenly seemed abhorrent to him. We then fast forward to everyone approaching two great statues on the shore. The very sight of these seemed to anger Isabella, just at the mere look of them. But the heretic, he barely even gave them a glance, as if he had seen many of them before. And these are strange statues, our narrator says, possessing 4 arms and cleft down the middle, also known as the statues of the ancients. The crew gets impressed by the craftsmanship and wonders what it took to make them, and they're even wanting to make camp there. But Isabella protests and says that they will not sleep in the shadows of these idols. And the narrator could have sworn that he heard the heretic chuckle at this, but it might have just been his imagination. And then we come to the mutiny. Or at least the idea of one that was completely stopped in its tracks because Isabella had found some incriminating pages that Alvaro had been writing. He decided to write a confession and says that it was of his own free will, but there's no real way to know for sure. He states that himself and about 8 men have been found guilty for seeking to abandon Captain Isabella, and the heretic has an interesting type of execution in mind. As we already know, Aeternum is a land that works a lot different than the traditional world. When people die, sometimes they come back. Maybe they'll come back different, but they do come back one way or another. Isabella and the heretic seemingly wanted to use this opportunity to test the resurrected properties, and both Alvaro and the narrator looked at each other and remembered the quote that the heretic said earlier about it not being his choice to wear the bindings. And it was at that moment that both of them realized this was not going to have a happy ending. So Isabella binds all 9 men up. At this point we don't know exactly what happened to Frederico, but it's safe to say he's probably dead or he's a part of this 9. They leave them there, but they don't execute them, and our narrator immediately finds this strange. They return the next day, and Isabella questions them if they regretted their actions. She went through each of them in turn, one by one, each of them apologizing and some even downright begging for their lives. They seemed extremely tired and much more desperate than before. Isabella nodded to each of the men, and the heretic nodded as well in her shadow, displaying a strange sort of feral grin, as if he was anticipating what was to happen, as the narrator describes. And then, the captain begins to kill each of the men one by one. Their bodies fall to the floor until none remain alive. The crew questions if they should remove their bonds, but Isabella declines. They leave them there, but in the morning they return. And yup, each of these men are resurrected and still bound in the same place. The island's properties are true, so Isabella, she kills them again. and the narrator observes this in pure horror, but he knows that it couldn't have been Isabella who conceived this. No, he thought of the heretic, and how he was weaving that rope in the tent, as if he was conjuring some sort of evil spell and knew exactly how this was to play out. And then that chapter comes to an end. We arrive at the next pages with the first one known as the lighthouse. The narrator says that they've spotted what seems to be a lighthouse in the distance, and the crewmates that remain have begun to travel again. But this one strangely seems to be completely abandoned. Isabella commands that they march towards it and declares that the location be named First Light, because as she claims it will likely be the very first beacon that one comes across when coming up to the shores, and they decide to set up camp near it for the night. The narrator describes it as a very curious structure. There were caves near the lighthouse that they explored the next day, and it was very clear that they were not the first ones to arrive and set foot on this island. They found various ancient weapons and armor. Some were unrecognizable, but others were clearly Roman swords and helmets, and even a Viking shield. They kept exploring similar caves like this, and both the heretic and Isabella decided to have a quick conversation about their next objective. He tells her that what she seeks will lie in the north. The narrator doesn't know what they seek, but he's extremely afraid that it'll cause Captain Isabella to do something rash. And then during travel, they come across a missing crewmate. It appears that someone else actually survived the shipwreck from their crew, and he had been living in a makeshift shelter on the shoreline and made simple tools to aid in his effort. Now our narrator and a couple of men were the first to find him. Isabella was not present during this time. The man's name was Demas, and he appeared pretty reluctant to follow them back to camp, and rightly so because of what happens next. Our narrator and the men bind him and warn him that he has to come along. They bring him back to camp and everybody notices. He gets marched straight up to Isabella's tent, and unsurprisingly she immediately declares him a deserter and has him bound and gagged and later beaten. They dragged him to a tree and bound him there so he would set an example, and later that night Ruiz seemed to have a change of heart. He goes to one of the men under the name Manuel and tells him that after what just happened, if they find any more of the crew, they need to warn them instead of bringing them back to camp. Manuel protested and said that Isabella would surely punish them for disobeying, and our narrator hissed back that they would be punished even for just following her orders. And the next day, Ruiz and some of the men were officially gone. That morning, Isabella demanded a search for them, claiming that they may have been attacked by some of the beasts that prowl the area, but Manuel saw it on her face. She knew the real reason they were gone, and she was very, very angry about it too. And so, after a few months since they had originally crashed on the island, it was time yet again for the crew to prepare to march. It seems that the scouts found an ancient road leading north about 2 days ago, so that's exactly what they start to travel on. Captain Isabella has not yet revealed their destination, and Manuel is not even sure if she knows herself. It seems like she simply seems to be searching for something and refuses to speak of it, but the ancient road takes them to the borders of a great marsh. Part of Manuel starts to wonder if this is where Ruiz may have fled with the rest of the men. This marsh seems to stretch out in many directions, but the scouts had spotted a peak in the distance. Captain Isabella commands that the men march for it and plans to use it to see more of the land and decide their next destination. And then we switch over to none other than Captain Pilot Chiez. It appears that both her and some of the crew of the San Cristobal have survived, but the ship, just like many others, did not get as lucky. Now from her perspective, she sees no trace of the Consolation or the Santiago, but she's still determined to send out crew to search for them as soon as they're able, because she feels that Isabella would do the same for them. So fast forward a bit, and the crew of the San Cristobal have set up a fortification and named it Consolation. A little fun fact about this fortification is that in the original alpha for New World, this was actually one of the available zones. Just between Windsward and Weaver's Fen is where this was, and that area is currently empty on the main map, and it does make me curious when and if this zone might be returning in the future. But back to the story. The crew is prospering a lot in the settlement fortification of Consolation. Their hunting parties are organized so they take care not to exhaust each area, and what they cannot hunt for, they were able to begin fishing from the waters of the island itself. The spirits on this side are relatively high, but regrettably, this was not set to last. So one of the crew that was sent out with the party in search of the other ships, Pilot Chiez overheard him say something strange. He said that everybody would be worse off if Captain Isabella was found, because during the journey she started to really diverge from the best interest of the crew. But Pilot Chiez was convinced that she was still noble. After a quick speech given to the crew, a short while after there was a fire spotted upon a location known as Weaver's Peak. It wasn't from one of the crew, and Pilot Chiez began setting up an expedition immediately to meet them the next day. And what should have been a joyous reunion was predictably an unsettling introduction. Of course, it wasn't anybody native to Aeternum that greeted them, it was Captain Isabella and her crew. Pretty much immediately, the tension started to rise between the crews, and Captain Isabella began demanding to know where they had been, the location of their ship, and where they had been on the island. Captain Chiez, still believing the good in her, started to ask what had become of her ship and more importantly the Santiago, and Chiez immediately realized upon Isabella's response that she didn't even care to look for them. Things escalated further when one of Isabella's crew wanted to see Chiez in secret the night after. He seemed extremely terrified of what Isabella would do if she found out, but he went on to outright list what Isabella had done, who she executed, and how the crew was still there not from loyalty, but fear. He also mentioned how he recalled Isabella was sick while aboard the ship, but more importantly how the heretic was still with them, and how he didn't trust him and was convinced that he had pure evil intentions. Well, this quickly escalated because that very same crewmate that had the conversation with Chiez, well, a couple days after, Chiez suddenly heard screams out of nowhere. She moved quickly to find out what happened, and found Isabella in front of a roaring fire, and that very same crewmate was being set ablaze. And at this point, Chiez knows that Isabella is absolutely not there to help them, and she saw all of them as traitors rather than crewmates. And from this, we come to a page known as Day 3. At this point, both Isabella and the fortification of Consolation are at full-on war. Isabella is literally throwing her crew at the walls of Consolation as if they were meant to die. She knows that the island grants eternal life, and she's trying to use this as a weapon to try to gain some ground against Pilot Chiez. But any ground that Isabella takes, Pilot Chiez takes back the very next day. The crew of San Cristobal knows the terrain, and they've taken to setting ambushes and building forts, and this goes on for months at a time. Isabella is also refusing all attempts to speak from Pilot Chiez. She wants nothing but to throw her crew mindlessly at this target in the hopes of gaining revenge against those supposed traitors. And eventually, Pilot Chiez is just straight up thinking the heretic's gotta die. He has somehow placed himself in a position of command, he's got this massive influence over Isabella and she treats his words as scripture, and even though he's in chains, he seems to be taking delight in this conflict. But not long after, Isabella vanishes. She abandons her remaining crew to be slaughtered, and about 5 of her men, including the heretic, are completely unaccounted for when Pilot Chiez searches her camp. And at this moment, Pilot Chiez is convinced that wherever they decide to go, God will not follow, and she fears that she will not see the captain again. Fast forward to a page known as the Bridge, and the heretic has now begun guiding their small group. The perspective now switches finally back to Isabella herself, and she is determined to keep heading north to find the prize she was promised. She still angers at the traitors of San Cristobal, and she plans to use whatever power she gains one day to exact revenge on them. The heretic begins guiding them through the region of Greatcleave. At this point, Isabella is starting to notice that she often sees red in the corners of her eyes. On their journey, one of the crew even falls directly into the cleave. Isabella cannot spend time to search for him, so they continue onward, all the way up to a great arch in the wall. Along the way, Isabella begins to think that the heretic has walked this path before, but not alone. There is a road, constructions, and the evidence of the passage of many feet long, long ago. Many have made this pilgrimage, and the heretic is but one of them. Or perhaps he has led thousands here, led them to the fountain and all its wonders. Now past this arch, it turns out that it's only Isabella and the heretic left. She starts to grow delirious and is unable to remember certain aspects about the days. The remaining crew members are nowhere to be found, and one of them seemed to be dead before she gathered everybody to go up north. But the heretic tells her that they are close now, and she's got no intention of stopping. Everything she's left behind, all the world and the trials that came with, it all led to this moment. And the promise of the new world and all its wonders, she feels that they were intended for her. The base of the mountain is where the heretic says they must go, and she asks him what they will find, to which he replies that they shall find such power that Aeternum itself, even the crown of the mountain itself, shall be lifted from its foundations, and all who come to the shores and beyond shall feel the power of it. We then come to the final pages. Starting with the mountain, Isabella says that they are so close now. She doesn't even feel the cold. The heretic questions her about what slows her pace, and she says that it's been so long. She says that she wishes she could stop for a moment, stop and pray that this is the right path. The thought of this brings memories to her. Memories of a simple stone chapel across the grounds, in the shelter of the trees of the place that she once called home. The heretic seems to share this memory, for he smiles. But the heretic, she thinks to herself, that isn't truly his name though, because to her, he had spoken truth. Only a little further now, he says, "Come, Isabella," but she does not hear his voice. And then, the final page known as the church. She tells him, even begs him that they must stop. She needs to collect her thoughts. There are so many now. If only she could stop for a short time and pray. The heretic, who's walking upright now instead of a hunch, says that you may pray here, pray at the base of this mountain, but the solid ground it will not serve. You must build a church, he says. It need not be a great thing. It need only be holy in your eyes. There you may speak your prayers, and there you shall know the truth of what you seek. Despite her crippling exhaustion, she grabs a stone from around her. She thinks to herself that it will be the church's walls, and she looks at the heretic and realizes that he is no longer her prisoner. She unshackles him, for he is instead a prophet, or perhaps even more. When the last stone is in place, he says, the way to the fountain will be granted. You will feel all of Aeternum course through you. You will live forever in this place, Isabella. But when he speaks her name, it is a language she does not know. But it must be a blessing, or perhaps a farewell. But a blessing it must be in Isabella's mind. A blessing it must be. And that concludes the origin story of Isabella. The crew of the San Cristobal did survive, and Pilot Chiez did search for Isabella, but she was never found. She feared that the heretic had been leading people and doing this for a very long time. But the crew of San Cristobal and Constellation will stand watch against those who arrive, if the island permits it, even if it should be 100 years. And should all that remain be the wrecks of their ships and these simple pages, let it be enough of a warning for those who come to Aeternum. Signed, Chief Pilot of the San Cristobal. And that is the story of the Daughter of Darkness, but where her journey takes her next, that'll be something we'll have to find out for ourselves. But if you want more information about what she's been doing since this time, check out my other lore videos that dive into the void, because Isabella's got plans for this island. And I think later on, that one way or another, we're going to come across something bigger and far more dangerous than anything we've seen thus far. But until then, have a wonderful night or day, and farewell.